hunters make their living tracing families of people who have died without leaving a will. They hand over thousands of pounds to unsuspecting relatives, money which would otherwise go to the government. Could they be knocking at your door? On today's show, the team tackle a family story which begins in the Indian Raj and reveals the unusual life of the rich and famous.
If someone's got an occupation like gentleman on their marriage certificate when they're 20 years old, that someone somewhere is financing them, the idle rich.
And a man who fled the Russians, fearing his secret life would endanger his family.
George's family would have been arrested and treated as enemies of the state.
Plus how you may be entitled to inherit some of the unclaimed estates held by the Treasury. Could thousands of pounds be heading your way? Every year in Britain, thousands of people die without leaving a will. If no obvious family can be found, their money goes straight to the government, who last year made over £18 million from unclaimed estates. That's where the heir hunting companies come in. Fraser & Fraser is just one of around 30 firms who make it their business to trace rightful heirs to unclaimed estates.
Our job is incredibly exciting. We're tracing family trees, delving back into people's history.
The company is run by Neil, Charles and Andrew Fraser. Fraser & Fraser have handled over £100 million worth of inheritance in the last 10 years alone. It's just gone 7 o'clock on the most important day of the week for the heir hunters. Every Thursday, the Treasury advertises new unclaimed estates. Company partner Charles Fraser is trying to decide which cases on the list the team should start working.
At the moment, nothing's looking particularly exciting. A lot of cases this morning where a lot of the deceased appear to be living in nursing homes, so we've got to wait until the nursing home opens, really.
The team usually begin by establishing if the deceased owned their own house, so they can then estimate the value of a case.
None of you have got anything here.
They have a team of travelling researchers who can knock on doors and find out more about the deceased. But today, even this is a problem.
So the question is, do I send Bob Barrett all the way to Wales?
Yeah, might as well, we haven't ignored him for ages.
With the office spreading their resources over all these small cases...
That is a grotty job to start with.
So after the fact, he died a couple months ago, and to home from that address.
I can't believe that's your proper daughter.
Neil takes the opportunity to have a look at a case he's received that's not on the Treasury's list. Yet.
So this is a case of Norma Grace Boylard. It's a case which has been given to us by a friend, and that they've passed us the information at the same time as all the information has been handed to the Treasury solicitor. It's great for us, it's how we prefer working, because it means we get to spend a decent amount of time on this case, contact all the beneficiaries nice and slowly, and not really do it a very rushed and sometimes aggressive sort of way. So we're going to be able to work this very, very nice and slowly.
This is a luxury for Neil, as there will be no competition from other firms until Norma Boyer's estate is advertised. But today looks like the perfect opportunity to get it started.
Our initial look has indicated that there is possibility of missing family. The initial inquiry has indicated that it's in excess of £30,000. So it's ticked both boxes, which has enabled us to start having a look at it now.
Norma Grace Boyer passed away on the 20th of June 2009, aged 79. She never married nor had children. Norma lived alone in her house in Battersea. She died a spinster, left no will, but was surrounded by a close circle of friends.
I always thought, what a very vibrant, glamorous, elegant lady she was. She had that personality to go with it. She was just so bubbly. Really, you sort of laughed with her and just enjoyed being in her company. According to Norma, she didn't have any relatives whatsoever. And that's why we treated her like a relative more than a friend, because we felt sorry for her.
In the office, Neil is trying to find out exactly what happened to Norma's family. He needs to discover who her parents were and trace the family tree back generation by generation, searching for living relatives who can inherit.
As far as the missing family goes, it looks as though the father of the deceased is born in India. That's certainly going to be a missing bit of family because we're dealing with an Indian family who doesn't look like they ever came to the United Kingdom. So we may have research all over the world on this. So we're really going to get on and start working now.
Norma's birth records reveal that she was born in Bournemouth in 1930, the only child of Grace Roos and Harcourt Boyer. Her father, Harcourt, was born in India, but her mother, Grace's birth, was registered in Battersea. The couple met in England after World War I, when he was a dashing young soldier and Grace was an opera singer with the Old Vic Opera Company. In 1926, Harcourt whisked her away to get married in India. Norma was born 4 years later, and both her parents signed the birth certificate. But Harcourt returned to India shortly after. For this reason, research director Alan believes the maternal side, the Roos family, should be a lot easier to find.
Well, the good information for me on the 1911 census, it tells me that the deceased mothers had 3 children, all of which are mentioned on the census. None of them have died.
The census has details of Norma's mother's entire family. Grace was the daughter of John Roos and Jessie Walsh. She had 2 brothers, John and Ernest. All their descendants could be heirs to Norma Boyer's estate. However, Ernest was born 11 years before John and Jessie's marriage.
One of the uncles appears to be of the half-blood. He's certainly born under the wrong surname. So at the moment we're not going to research too much on him. The other uncle, it looks like had 1 child, but that child died as a 5-year-old. So as far as I'm concerned now, it looks like on the maternal side we won't find any beneficiaries.
The only possible heirs on Norma's mother's side would be Uncle Ernest's children, if he had any. But they'd only inherit if there was no family on Norma's father's side. So Neil is forced to tackle the potentially tricky family in India.
We've got Norma, the deceased. Her father is Harcourt. Now, all we know about him is that he married the mother of our deceased out in India. He certainly travelled to England, and he was here in around about 1929 sort of time. We know that Grace, the mother, when she originally travelled here, was travelled by herself.
I'm assuming that's his daughter.
It's now Harcourt's records that Neil needs to find, and they are sending researcher Mike off to the British Library, where most of the colonial records are stored.
When the British were in India, when it was part of when it was a colony, because there was such a large British population, they had their own churches, and in those churches people were getting married, buried, and christened, and it's those records that we're using.
However, with his distinctive name, Harcourt Vernon Boyer, Neil's hoping he'll crop up somewhere in the company's own library.
Write it into the...
Is that the who's who, is it?
It's got a who's who.
The Indian who's who. There you go, there's Harcourt, an inspector in charge of excise in Jalpaiguri.
Of the dozen so books we've got next door on India, we've been able to find the father of the deceased referenced in that, and indeed one of the uncles of the deceased. We've got a reference for him. So out of 500 million people and 12 books, we've found 2 of our family, which is, it's an incredibly high strike rate considering.
At last, a breakthrough. And against all odds, Neil has discovered that Norma's father, Harcourt, was born in 1889 in Jamalpur, the son of Ernest Boyer and Georgiana Scott. Their marriage certificate from 1876 lists Ernest's profession as a private gentleman. Could this case be worth more than the £30,000 Neil first thought?
Well, I tend to assume that if someone's got an occupation like gentleman on their marriage certificate when they're 20 years old, that someone somewhere is financing them, the idle rich. I tend to assume also that there's going to be a bit of money in the family, so they're not going to be the employed, they're going to be the employers.
One of the few bits of information they have been able to find is a will belonging to Norma's grandfather, Ernest Boyer, who died in Calcutta in 1928.
Everyone else around us has gone home, apart from the three of us working this case, which is quite typical, really. But it's some names which have come up on a will back in 1928. They now have started to make sense. And what we've done is we've identified a lady called Gertrude Harriet Bullard in 1883, born in 1883. Now, she is an aunt of the deceased. Found a marriage for her in 1904 in Bengal, and from that we've got 3 children.
Norma's Aunt Gertrude married William Webster in 1904 in Bengal. The couple had 3 sons, Glenn, Frederick and Arthur. And while they were all born in India, Arthur Webster is recorded to have died in Nottingham in 1993. Finally, the first sign of the Boyer family in the UK. It's a fantastic find. What's more, Arthur was a doctor, and if he practiced in England, Alan is hoping he'll appear in a medical directory in the library.
We've got a cousin of the deceased called Arthur Wright Scott Webster, who on his death is described as a medical practitioner. And I've just checked the medical directory, and sure enough, he does come up. He's also at the same address that he died at 30 years later, in Nottingham.
Despite Neil's fears that the Indian family would be hard to crack, after just one day, they are now possibly on their way to finding a potential heir to Norma Boyer's estate of at least £30,000. This case is really picking up pace, but it's past 6 o'clock and far too late to get any further. Still to come, Neil and his team hit the road and uncover more intriguing family secrets.
Glad you went there, because we wouldn't have got that out of the coroner otherwise. It's good work.
When heir hunters investigate cases of people dying without leaving a will, they come across fascinating stories which otherwise would have been left untold. George Remin was one such case. He was a mysterious man without family and whose friends knew nothing about his past.
I've known George for almost 20 years, from the very first day he moved in next door. We asked him many times where he was from, but he would never mention, but from his accent, we thought he was from Russia.
George Remin had a secret, and it was only after his death that his friends came to realise that this ordinary man had anything but an ordinary past. George passed away in January 2008. He had lived in Cardiff since the 1950s and worked in a delicatessen. He never married or had children. George had been in the same house for 20 years and lived a frugal lifestyle. Because of this, he left a valuable property and cash savings. His total estate was worth around £330,000. Because George had left no will, his name appeared on the Treasury's list of unclaimed estates in November 2008. The case was picked up by Peter Birchwood of Celtic Research. He runs the company from home in Wales, together with his stepson Hector, who is based in London. They will research cases anywhere in the world, but their core team consists of regional case managers based in Essex, Liverpool and Cardiff. To research a name such as Remin, Peter suspected he might need help from one of his foreign agents, but first of all he contacted his company's man in Cardiff.
As soon as I got the information about the case and that it was down around Cardiff, I asked Phil to go over there, do his best to find out anything at all about the deceased from the neighbours and the friends, and also to just pick up a death certificate so we might have an indication when and where the deceased was born.
Phil works for Celtic Research on a case-by-case basis and has set up an office in his shed in his back garden. He was only too happy to take on the investigation into George Remin's estate.
Well, initially with George, we didn't know much about him. From the death certificate, we knew he'd been a storekeeper, born in the Ukraine, and he had died in Cardiff.
Next, Phil made contact with neighbours and colleagues of the deceased, looking for further information about George's background. One of the people he found was Asha Makwana, who had lived next door to George for over 20 years.
With him, he was like a father figure to us and a grandfather figure for my children. He had his own little world, him and his plants and his house, and Sometimes he used to grow coriander for me in his allotment and bring it over, and rosemary and stuff like that.
Growing his own vegetables in a meticulously kept allotment and getting around on his bicycle, George was a self-sufficient man.
I always used to say, George, when are you going to retire? Oh, I'm retired, but I still like to work. He always liked to work.
But George's past was a mystery.
We always asked him about his family, but he never wanted to speak about his family. He'd change the subject straight away. He'd just say, oh, I came here in a war and that's it. You know, nothing else from George. But that's George, all right, because he will only say what he wants to say. He won't make anybody else sort of push him with anything.
Delving further into the case, Phil made contact with more of George's neighbours, friends and colleagues and started to piece together his history.
There's no next of kin or any close relatives living anywhere in the country. He had served in the war. He had worked as a labourer, but he kept it very private.
Phil now discovered, far from being Russian, George was born in the Ukraine. And as he delved into his past, he realised that George's early life was dominated by the turmoil of Stalin's Soviet Union. George was born in 1924, the same year that Stalin took command of the Soviet Union, which most of Ukraine was part of at that time.
In the 1920s, Ukraine strived and had the desire to have its own independent state. The Soviet authorities obviously appreciated that without Ukraine, the Soviet Union couldn't exist, because Ukraine at that time was regarded as being the breadbasket of Europe.
The Ukraine was a key asset the Soviet Union could not afford to lose, and Stalin was determined to crush the independence movement.
Stalin employed thugs, for want of a better word, who would go around villages and ensure that everybody had delivered up all forms of grain, and then shortly afterwards all foodstuffs were being collected and deposited in these grain stores and exported or left there to rot.
Stalin was denying Ukrainian farmers access to any of their own produce and was systematically starving the population. It was an act of barbarism, which is known in the Ukraine as the Holodomor.
There were what we regard as hotspots of the Holodomor, and the area where George came from, that was extremely badly affected by the Holodomor.
The Holodomor reached its peak in 1933, when young George would have been 8 years old. In this year, 25,000 people died every day.
A large part of the population in central and eastern Ukraine was simply annihilated. As many as 7 to 10 million people were simply starved to death. And that all happened over a period of approximately 12 to 18 months.
The horrors of the starvation would have been seen by children like George on a daily basis. Maria Volkova, who was just 6 at the time, lived in the same area as George's family.
One time, I asked my mother for something to eat, and she told me she didn't have anything. She said, "You have to go outside and eat the leaves," and I did. We couldn't eat them, they were so bitter.
The famine claimed young victims first, and amongst the school children in George's hometown, conditions were desperate.
In my village, there were 28 children that attended school in the spring of 1933. Later that year, there were only 12 of my classmates left. The rest had all died from famine.
Memories of such a devastating time would have stayed with George for the rest of his life. As the investigation continued, Phil began to unravel George Remin's mysterious past and why he kept it secret from everyone who knew him.
It's highly likely that information would have been picked up on by the Soviet embassy in London, quickly passed on to Moscow, and George's family in Ukraine would no doubt have been arrested and treated as enemies of the state.
every case that's cracked, there are still thousands on the Treasury's list that remain a mystery. The deceased's assets are kept for up to 30 years in the hope that eventually someone will remember and come forward to claim their inheritance. And with the estates valued at anything from £5,000 to millions of pounds, the rightful heirs are out there, somewhere. Today we've got 2 cases that the heir hunters have been unable to solve so far. Could you know the answer? Maybe you're in line for a payout. Anthony Reagan died in London on the 16th of May 2005. Did you know Anthony? Or perhaps you might be part of his estranged family. Could your information lead to the heirs? Doreen Mary Perry, née Clark, a widow from Malden, Essex, died on the 30th of January 2008. So far, all efforts to trace her relatives have drawn a blank. Are you a family friend, or perhaps believe you could be related? Could either of these 2 estates be meant for you, rather than the government? On the case of George Remin, Phil from Celtic Research had been making inquiries with the deceased's friends and neighbours in Cardiff. After just a few days' investigation, he had established that heirs to George's estate were most likely to be found in the Ukraine, and to track them down, Phil would need help.
At this point, I pass the information onto the office, and they get as quickly as possible get the information over to our agents in Germany who cover Europe.
Thanks to Phil's excellent detective work in Wales, an agent could be sent directly to George's hometown.
Without the indication of the town he came from, with a name like Remin, which is almost as common as Jones in Wales, it would have been almost impossible.
In the Ukraine, the agent made a surprising discovery. It looked as if George might have a sister, and if that could be confirmed, she would be the sole heir to £330,000. In Ukrainian terms, this would make her the equivalent of a millionaire and could put her in danger. The team at Celtic Research had to protect her identity and tread very carefully as they proceeded with the case. The agent who had been sent to the Ukraine soon reported back to Peter in Wales.
The research on the Remin case did enable us, via our German associates, to find the sister of the deceased.
The agent established that George Remin was born in 1924. His parents, who originally came from Yugoslavia, had 2 children, George and his younger sister. This confirmed without a doubt that she was the closest living relative and therefore the only heir. This amount of money will completely change her life forever. Before the money is paid out, George's sister has asked Celtic Research to deal with the estate in the UK on her behalf. Phil and his wife are given access to George's house in Cardiff. They have taken George's neighbour and friend Asher with them.
Horrible weather, isn't it?
It is horrible.
They are looking through George's personal effects, searching for items that could be worth sending to the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So you fixed
Studs, yeah.
Okay, is that George?
Could be George when he was younger.
Okay.
I knew him when he was a little bit older, you know, yes,
Okay.
about up 61, 62.
Right, so there we go.
There we are, that's more like George. That's George, yeah, definitely. I mean, the boys he was with.
Yes, I
came,
think
innit?
so, yeah.
So far, they had only pieced together one part of George's mysterious past. They knew he had lived through an atrocious famine in the Ukraine during his childhood. But he had a sister who survived it too. What could have pulled them apart and led George to start a new life in Wales?
Okay, he's got a cutting of Stalin
in his coffin. And
lying in state.
The last view of Stalin as he lies in state.
The most revealing piece in the puzzle of George's life story was tucked in amongst his papers.
That's when he was young, is it?
Yeah.
All right.
It's an army identity card, which shockingly reveals that he served in the German army. Is this the secret George was hiding for so long? How did his childhood under Stalin lead to his fighting for the Nazis?
From the documents that we've seen that were collected from George's house, it's clear that George did fight in German uniform. There are many ways in which he may have found himself in that position.
There was no love lost between Ukrainians and Stalin in the years running up to World War II. After the invasion of the Soviet Union, George was one of thousands of Ukrainians to cooperate with the Nazis.
The Germans obviously understood that Ukrainians were extremely anti-Soviet, and they utilised that burning desire for Ukrainians to push back its old adversary, if you like, or its old enemy, being Stalin and the Communist Soviet Union.
George was haunted by the memory of his life under Stalin's regime. Articles reporting Stalin's death were found amongst his possessions.
There's probably no doubt in his mind that Stalin was responsible for the death of his own family members, and he probably waited for Stalin to die.
Fighting Stalin, George was on the losing side of the war, and in the aftermath, soldiers who had fought for the Germans were persecuted in Soviet Ukraine.
The mere fact that he fought against the Red Army, he would have most certainly faced execution.
George arrived in Wales in 1948 and lodged with the owners of a deli in the city centre, who gave him a job. He worked hard, never relying on anyone for help, and carefully saving his money. For George Remin, the former Nazi officer, Wales was a safe haven, and in Cardiff he completely reinvented himself. George made good friends, but most of them didn't even know which country he was from, because when it came to his past, he had no choice but to keep it to himself.
If he made it public that he fought in German uniform during the Second World War, a local newspaper may have got hold of the story. It's highly likely that that information would have been picked up on by the Soviet embassy in London, quickly passed on to Moscow, and George's family in Ukraine would no doubt have been arrested and treated as enemies of the state.
Making the choice to escape the Ukraine for the safety of Wales cannot have been easy. To save his life, George had to cut all ties with friends and family. And starting afresh in a country that had just gone through the Blitz, he could certainly not risk anyone finding out that he had fought for the enemy. For Peter Birchwood, this was a fascinating case. But a report back from the Ukraine did put another sad twist on George's story.
The heir to George Remin, his sister, had thought him dead at the time of the close of the war, and was shocked to find that he'd survived and had somehow got himself to Wales, where she had never had any idea that he could ever go to.
George's hard-earned savings will now go to his sister, a life-changing sum that might go some way to compensate for the fact she thought he was dead. Thanks to Phil's research, George's life story is finally out in the open. And more importantly, George's sister can find out all about his life in Cardiff.
I just wish I actually had met him and knew him, rather than be delving into his family afterwards. But at least we're going to be able to pass this sort of thing on to his sister. I'm happy we found such a close relative still alive.
It's day 2 on the investigation into Norma Boyer's estate. In a week when the cases advertised by the Treasury solicitor offered slim pickings.
None of you have got anything here. Mansell's gone.
The case was referred to Fraser and Fraser by a friend of the deceased. And from his research so far, it looks to Neil like it could be worth at least £300,000, and possibly a lot more, as she comes from a wealthy family.
Well, I tend to assume that if someone's got an occupation like gentleman on their marriage certificate when they're 20 years old, that someone somewhere is financing them, the idle rich. I tend to assume also that there's going to be a bit of money in the family, so they're not going to be the employer, they're going to be the employers.
With the other cases started on Thursday coming to an end, Neil can now begin to use some more of the team in tracking down Norma's heirs.
I've sent out my first traveller, and that's Paul. And Paul has gone out to pick up a death certificate over here for someone we found late yesterday, an Arthur Webster. Now, Arthur's born in India in and around 1910, and we think he passed away in Nottingham in 93.
From his base in Birmingham, Paul Matthews is on his way to the Nottingham Register Office to get the death certificate of Norma's cousin Arthur, a doctor.
OK, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Okay,
what Neil is hoping for is that the informant on Arthur Webster's death certificate will be a family member and potentially the first heir to Norma Boyer's estate.
Hello. Right, got that death. It's not all what you wanted, I don't think. Well, he wanted a good informant on the actual death, but we haven't got one because there's a coroner's inquest, so there's no informant listed.
The reason we travelled to Nottingham all the way for Paul to pick it up is because we were hoping for a decent informant. Now, the informant is what we would describe as nondescript. It means the informant's relationship to the deceased is not son, daughter, wife, husband, something like that, instead of it being the coroner. Now, the reason the coroner informed on it is because Arthur has unfortunately committed suicide. So, because someone commits suicide, that gets passed to the coroner, and he has to do an inquest. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's a post-mortem or anything, but there's certainly an inquest. And the coroner has files for that.
To get access to a coroner's report, the team might have to wait for up to a week. But Paul has already made one journey to Nottingham and wants to make the most of it. He gets straight on the phone to the coroner, and it doesn't take long before he gets his hands on the report. It seems the search for Norma Boyer's heirs is back on track.
We're not overly concerned with the actual circumstances of how he passed away.
Yeah.
We're more concerned with if there's any mention of any relatives who may have been present or involved.
Well, what we find here is the people that gave evidence as witnesses at the inquest.
Could I spend just 5 minutes just going through that? Just see what else?
Yeah.
Paul's instincts as an ex-policeman are kicking in. The inquest report is the team's only lead in Nottingham, and he wants to leave no stone unturned in his search for relatives of Arthur Webster. After just 10 minutes, in amongst the paperwork is exactly what Paul is looking for: details of one of Arthur Webster's children.
The coroners have rushed this inquest report through, and whereas initially they said that there was nothing on there, I'm now going through the file page by page, and we found a daughter.
Oh, you've got a daughter? Great.
Thanks to Paul's perseverance at the coroner's, the team have got details of their first heir to Norma Boyer's estate. It's a daughter of Arthur Webster. She is in the UK at the time of her father's death in 1993, and there's every chance she is still at the same address. It's the first beneficiary on the Boyer case.
I'm bloody glad you went there, because we wouldn't have got that out of the coroner otherwise, so it's good work.
Cheers, mate. Bye. Bye. Oh, the boss is very happy because we've had a very, very good result. By actually, when everything else failed, just trying the long shot, coming along here, going through the file. The coroner's department have been absolutely superb. They're only letting us obviously see what's not sensitive, but by reading this file, it's turned up trumps for us, so it's spot on, very, very good.
Paul heads back to Birmingham, knowing that the information he has given to Neil led to a major break on the Boyer case and led them to an heir. Neil has dispatched Bob Barrett, the company's man in Surrey, to pay the heir a visit. Alan and Neil have also been working hard on the family tree and made further advances on the previously impenetrable Boyer side of the family. Alan has uncovered another potential heir, Myra, a cousin once removed from the deceased.
That's Myra. Oh, she got married?
They obviously like Indian weddings. In Bideford. Well, she's got about 3 middle names. Myra, M-D-M. I reckon.
Myra fits into a different stem of the Boyer family, that of Norma's Aunt Nesta. Nesta had 3 children. Her eldest daughter, Phyllis, was born in India, but travelled back to England after independence. And with her was little Myra, aged 11. Neil has been able to trace Myra to Devon, and he's got her on the phone.
Hello, is that Mrs. Lang? Hello, I'm terribly sorry to disturb you. I'm trying to speak to a Myra Lang, who would have been born around 1935, give or take a few years. The daughter of a Phyllis, maiden name would have been Rogers.
So I thought, well, that's very odd. I said, how do you know my name? He said, well, you were born in India and you were 11 when you arrived in England with your mother. I said, how does he know all this? What's he on about?
Let me explain what this is about. We are genealogists and probate researchers, and we specialise in tracing family trees and locating missing beneficiaries when people die without leaving valid wills or known next of kin.
After the initial shock and a more thorough explanation of the situation, Myra signed an agreement with Frasers, and she was very excited to find out more about the case.
So, not about the money, you're supposed to, not the inheritance so much. It's getting to know people that I didn't know were there. I'd love to see it get in touch with family, because my children want to know as well. They're really excited about it because on my mother's side I can't tell them anything. Their father's side they know quite a lot.
Surprisingly, the only person Myra did know well in the family was Harcourt, the deceased Norma Boyer's father.
Harcourt was my granduncle, my mother's uncle, but he was only about 12 years older than her, so that's why they were such friends.
Harcourt lived in Darjeeling, which was near to Myra's school, and she would often go with her mother to stay with him for the weekend.
She had a black spaniel, Nellie, and she had puppies once, and of course I'd go to try and pick up these puppies, and he used to say, Myra, don't, because Nellie will snarl at you, which she did, of course. But, yes, I mean, he was a lovely chap, really.
Myra had a closer relationship with Harcourt than his own daughter Norma ever did.
I'm sure that Norma would have liked to have had her mother and father around her all the time, but because her father had to stay in India and her mother couldn't stay out with him, she was parted from her father, who I believe she had a lot of affection for, and he did for her. And we know that she had lots of Christmas cards sent over the years and lots of letters that were very endearing and very affectionate in the way they were written. She must have really been broken-hearted that they couldn't all be together.
Myra saw Harcourt regularly in the early 1940s, at a time when his daughter Norma was about 10 and living in England.
Well, I didn't know the wife or the daughter because I don't think they were ever with him in India. They might have been, but not as far as I know. I think he spent a little while in England to start with when they first got married. And then he went to India, and I think he stayed there most of the time, certainly right through the war, I think.
Neil has yet to discover the true value of this case, but the story of the Boyer family has had a poignant end.
Myra's been able to fill us in with great information, really, about Harcourt, the deceased father. Myra, in later life, would have been a very, very good ally to Norma. She would have been able to fill her in a lot more details than can ever be written down on a postcard. So it's just such a shame they never met.
If you want to know more about genealogy and tracing your family, then visit our website at bbc.co.uk.
Living it up on the other side of the world, will the dream become a reality for a family from Newcastle? Wanted Down Under is next. Then rescue an abandoned house and renovate it. That's the mission when we search for Britain's empty homes today at 11.